Hi, I'm Rob Neilson, and I'm your host today for episode 2 of KYield's Enterprise Artificial Intelligence Principles. In episode 1, we went through 1 through 4. Today, we're going to go through principles 5 through 10. The principles are located on the KYield.com website. I suggest you download them, and then you can follow along. It's like we're all singing from the same sheet of music. So let's go. I'm here with Mark Montgomery, CEO and founder. I'll dispense with long backgrounds. That's in episode 1. So let's launch off on principles 5 through 10. First question. We covered in the first episode principles 1 through 4. Taking off from there, the 5th principle is maintain objectivity. How difficult is it to establish and maintain objectivity in enterprise-wide AI systems?
Thanks, Rob. It is a constant challenge. There's been a lot of focus on objectivity and biases in AI in the last year or two for good reason. And one of the reasons why it's a constant challenge, of course, is that all humans have bias. It's inherent in how we learn and how we're brought up and in what we consume, the information that we consume, our environments, our cultures, etc. So that extends to the actual work and the development work of algorithms and systems design and everything else that we do, the language, the data that we're using that trains on. So it's a constant challenge. It's not a scenario where it can be perfect. So we're not able to ever achieve perfection. But the good news is that when done properly, AI systems can dramatically reduce the bias that we have in our data, in our workflow. And so that's the basics of the situation that we're in. For example, I have bias, and you can see it in our system that we are strongly in favor of human rights, and we're strongly disfavor, consciously, dystopia, and hopefully you can see that in our systems.
Thank you, Mark. All right, let's go on to the next question. Principle number 6 is provide privacy, transparency, and explainability. Please describe how the KYield OS achieves these important functions across the enterprise.
Yes, thanks. Well, the KYield OS is essentially designed for the individual. We'll get into that a little bit later, but for now, I'll just explain a couple of the ways that we achieve it. For example, every individual at any time, we have a tab in the navigation bar that they can click on, and it's a link. And you get a little pop-up window that tells you what algorithms are being used for what purpose at any time. So there's different types of algorithms. We use a variety, machine learning, deep learning, genetic algorithms, others for the specific type of function that we're doing. So it changes when you're using different types of parts of the system for different reasons, but that's always there for individuals to check. And so that provides a transparency and explainability of, so you're not going to be able to, we don't get really deep into the technical aspects of it, at least for the average user, the average customer, individual, because we're assuming that they're not PhDs in machine learning. However, that provides the general basics and transparency, and that it provides a trustworthy environment. And so that's one example of how we do it. Now, there is one exception, and it's system-wide. That's not for necessarily the individual directly. Indirectly, it is for all individuals in the organization, and that is security. So like any organization, you have to have security. So we have we have algorithms that look for anomalies for insider risk. So it can be, for example, intellectual property risk that might be being shared improperly. It might be a physical risk to the organization that you find an anomaly. It could be a more systemic risk to the organization. It could be in the supply chain with partners. There's many different types of risk that we're looking for the anomaly. And so if that pops up as the system finds an anomaly, then that gets passed on to the proper high-level security people who then manage it in a compliant manner, just like any other security. And that's that's the same with a virtual system like this or a physical system. If you have a real threat in your organization, your physical organization that comes in the door, you obviously want security immediately notified so they can take diligent action on it. So it's the same concept, but otherwise the entire system really, because the organizations are full of individuals, of course, we're made up of individuals. And so the whole purpose of the system is to enhance the workflow quality of workflow of the individuals in the organization.
Thank you, Mark. Principle number 7 is empower individuals. The rationale being that every organization consists of individuals, as you just mentioned. So if we want the organization to be successful, we should be empowering individuals. Kind of makes sense. The implications are that organizations that lose sight of these needs of individuals tend to experience lower morale, higher turnover, and cultural deterioration. Empowering individuals has proven easier said than done. Can you explain how the KYield OS empowers individuals? Yes,
thanks. We do so in several ways, but I'll touch on a couple of the sort of primary ways we do it. For one is that the individual module in the system. So again, we have in the basic patented system, we have a data management system that the AI systems are run on, and that is a CKO engine that provides governance for the whole organization. We have a group module for, let's say, business units or large groups. That's sort of a minimal or a small version of the CKO engine. Then we have team and individual modules. So every individual in the system, and preferably every individual in the organization, has their own individual module. I call it a module because it is a modular system, but it's also known as Dana. And the Dana is like a virtual assistant, and it tailors the data to the actual needs of the individual. So that's how we get augmentation. So to my knowledge and awareness, KYield was the first ever in history to have a augmentation in a system for the individual work tailored to each individual. So we do that in a couple of ways. One is that it learns from history of the individual behavior and what the individual does in their behavior in the system, which, by the way, we only track part of that data, only the necessary data. We don't even have access to this. So this is not, again, not like spying on anyone. It's hardwired not to spy on anyone. And so this is really just for the individual. It enhances their workflow. The other way that is actually more of a built-in function of the system that each individual can input what they're interested in the future. So it's really more like a simulation. So the individual can say, okay, I have a, let's say I'm an attorney and I have a special project coming up, or a scientist. And it's a really important project and I need to study up on certain things. So they could put that in their module, even put in a time frame, and then the KYield OS would actually be proactively searching for valuable pre-valued information, high quality information, to alert the individual so that they could read and it provide that. So that's another way that we empower and augment the work of the individual. Now we have a whole nother system that we're going to talk about later, so I won't talk about it too much here, but knowledge capital, which is another way that we translate the actual workflow of the work product and incentivize individuals. But that's a whole principle, so we won't spend a lot of time on that here.
Thank you. You mentioned in the first episode that you had a eureka moment in the 1990s when you conceived the KYield theorem, which, by the way, is patented. Principle number 8 is adopt enterprise-wide architecture. Could you please describe to our audience how enterprise-wide architecture can result in a whole that's greater than its parts?
Yes. Well, this is an extension of the first principle, which is governance and built-in systemic integrity in the system. And enterprise-wide is a preferable way to do this. And that's why we give actually financial incentives to encourage organizations to extend it throughout their enterprise. Because the way these things work, and studying events for the past 25 years, many of the largest catastrophes and many corporate crises, the one individual that you don't, or maybe it's a class of individuals, a certain department that is not included in the system, may very well be the ones that see existential risk, but they're not hardwired into the system. So they don't have a very effective manner to get that into the organization and automatically get it to the right people at the right time and affect the right type of action to take place to prevent it. We just had another in the Wall Street Journal this morning about the Capitol Police and the situation with the riots in DC, where again, there were in every single case, just about, we're talking about 98% of the crises, major catastrophes, all types, where there are warnings put out by the people in charge, the experts in charge, and they don't act on it in time. Now, it's not their problem or their fault. It's usually the just the bureaucracy itself. Excuse me. Sometimes it's political protectionism. A lot of times it's fear of accountability. They're afraid. A lot of different reasons why. Sometimes it just gets lost in the cracks in the organization. So we have this hardwired in our system. So every individual. So for example, a janitor somewhere sees something that they think might be important, or it might be in the same store in a retailer throughout the whole chain. May even be a customer service. I've actually seen this, or a customer service in a large retail organization was seeing a large amount of returns for a certain product built in China. And they couldn't get it through their management, up through the management. No one was noticing this. So they had these huge, returns because of a product defect that was costing the company millions of dollars. And they really had no effective way in their system to get that to the right people. And so this would be right there in their module, and automatically all they would need to do is take a picture, track it, and it would get to the right people. So enterprise-wide is very, very important for things like prevention, but it's also really valuable for enhanced productivity. It can be critical for security. So you really, I did a whole talk, as you know, on in conferences and
Right.
the universities and nonprofit conferences on the enterprise-wide systems is really important. So that's why it deserves to have its own principle.
You mentioned in an earlier presentation about the prevention of catastrophes provides the highest return on investment possible. So it's not surprising that turbocharging prevention is one of the principles. Please describe how prevention works in enterprise AI, and more specifically, the KYield OS.
Well, as you know, Rob, this is really a passion of mine going back for decades. And we've studied every major catastrophe that we could in many, we're talking about dozens of corporate crises. And we've had extensive discussions, deep dives with major corporations that had some of the largest crises over the past, especially the last decade. So we've learned as much as we can. Sometimes there's a lot of information made public. So one, for example, that published a lot of information is the Deepwater Horizon, or otherwise known as the BP oil spill in the Gulf. And that was really unusual because there were several actual reports and investigations done. And the company, to their credit, agreed to allow it to be published so that everybody could learn from this. And so I'll try and condense this. This is a very complex discussion, but basically we have two types of prevention in the KYield OS. And that is, the first is prevention that's built into the KYield OS that everyone has it. It's built in, it was built in from the beginning. So every installation of the KYield OS has this basic prevention function. And that's sort of a generic prevention for any type of organization. As you know, we talked about earlier, the KYield OS is universal to any type of organization. And so the prevention function is as well. And so that provides you the basic, there's dozens of things that it looks for that are common patterns, different types of algorithms are used, but that will, it's targeting major prevention and minor sort of everyday type of crises that build up over time and become, large over a year's time, several years. The second type of prevention, excuse me, we have allergies out here in New Mexico, excuse me, is the, and I was out running yesterday, I did my 4-mile loop, so I got a bunch of allergies. But the second type of prevention is, is our HumCat program. Hang on just a second, sorry.
No problem.
There, that's better. Is our HumCat program that we pioneered a few years ago, as you well know. And that is a more powerful prevention functionality that's built on top of the KYield OS. And that is, not only is it a lot more powerful computing, it typically requires special hardware. Whereas the standard KYield OS, if an organization has modern infrastructure, they probably don't need to install anything additional. Whereas the HumCat program, if it's an internally installed in a corporate data center, or even on the hybrid cloud, it requires a lot more computing power. And so it's a more expensive installation, but it provides a lot more powerful prevention capabilities. And it can be used for specialized situations. So we pioneered this situation to make it more attractive and easier for organizations to install prevention, because it is the highest ROI possible in sort of incumbent organizations. There's nothing that even comes close to the ROI of a major prevention. For example, the BP situation I mentioned, that ended up being a $65 billion event for BP. Mm-hmm. It was almost fatal. They didn't even know when we were talking to them years ago whether or not the company was going to survive or not. There was just, there were criminal and civil liabilities. They just had no idea. And so that type of scale, and since then, there's actually been several corporate events that were in the tens of billions that were all preventable if you had the right type of system installed, I should say. It not necessarily at the time. At BP, it would have been probably a little bit early for the technical viability, but certainly today we have the capabilities to prevent the vast majority of crises. And so the HumCat program, what it does is we combine with an option of finance. So there's certain tools. One that we pioneered was ILS for insurance-linked security. It's used for other things like hurricanes and states and islands, or FEMA does an annual large ILS. It's a bond, essentially, insurance-linked security. But we can apply ILS and other financial instruments to an installation that can actually pay for the installation. And it can reduce at the same time, because the data risk profile from the rich data, and you share very limited data to bondholders or regulators. You have the option to do that, but it actually can improve your credit rating, for example. So you could get better interest rates on loans, on the bonds, if you're a large city, a state, public or private organization. So that's it's a fairly complex program, but it's really, really interesting. And we really just need the right customers to sponsor it, and then we're off and running. It's a great program.
Thank you, Mark. Moving on, flat productivity is one of the greatest challenges facing the global economy. Principle 10 is accelerate discovery and productivity, which is potentially has enormous implications for companies and nations. Can you peel back the onion on that one?
Yeah, productivity is another one of those. We have there's basically 4 functions that are embedded in the KYield OS, the universal KYield OS, every single one of them. One is really not really a function there. It includes functions. That's the governance function. And that's system-wide. That's a CKO engine. The other 3 functions that are included in every KYield OS is enhanced security. That's multiple types of proprietary security that we build in to the system. Is designed in from very early on. And the prevention that we just discussed, there are 2 types. The one type that's included in every installation of the KYield OS. And then on top of that, we have the option for the HumCat, which is the more powerful that looks at specific type of risks. And then we have enhanced productivity that we discussed a little bit earlier with the individual module, or DANA, that is tailors data to each individual module, each individual's workflow and work product, and automatically. So if you can envision, for example, the areas where we really badly need increased productivity, one is healthcare, especially in the United States. We have 18% GDP. It's twice as high as the next costliest in another country. And the quality of, at least by most sort of third-party unbiased reviews, our quality is not even in the top 10 anymore. So that people find that hard to believe, Americans, because we're so accustomed to being the first in the world in all these areas. But one of the reasons is the type of technology adoption. Our healthcare system is actually much slower to adopt new technologies today than some others are. And so they're passing us up and leaving us behind. So healthcare is a perfect example where, envision, if you will, surgeons, nurses, physicians, administrators, all having individual modules, or the DANA module that tailors deep. We can go as deep as molecular level. Actually, you can go as the atomic level if you have the compute power, and drill down into the specific areas and tailor both the education, the workflow, and new information that comes in, tie into regulators, tie into your peers. It accelerates the learning ability. And we'll talk about that in the 3rd episode more when we talk about continuously adapting. But that's the idea, is that then it's hooked up to the whole system, so it's a continuous loop and a continuous learning process. And that goes back to the original theorem of yield management of knowledge, which is a mathematical theorem. And this is really the way we achieve that in the system. So that's productivity on the individual level. And then through the individuals, that's how you increase productivity. But one area, for example, that I want to discuss just briefly, that I think is the most important, is productivity enhancement in research and development. I think that represents the largest opportunity, especially in terms of at the national level, organizational level, but it also represents the greatest risk. And that's why Putin's warning a few years ago is accurate. And he says, what did he say? Something like whoever controls AI, whoever masters AI will rule the world. And of course, our situation, the democracy lovers, is that we don't want anyone to rule the world. We want to maintain democracy and have democracy survive. However, if these totalitarian governments, one of my greatest concerns that I've warned leaders in the public sector, members of Congress, the White House, the DoD, and others, governors, and many others, is that those who use this advanced technology to accelerate R&D, and they adopt it more rapidly, really are the greatest risk. And those totalitarian nations are the greatest risk in the world today, in my view, because I'm very familiar with it. I've seen the patterns, and I recognize the potential in it. So that's my greatest concern of abuse. But the flip side is also true. If you're an organization that wants to stay in the lead, or achieve the lead, this is really how you're going to do it in the future.
Thanks, Mark. Hey, just as a follow-up from episode 1 and episode 2, there's a whole bunch of concern out there about job loss, both in the public and private sector. What kind of jobs do you think will be displaced in the near term and long term?
Well, the most obvious are that I use as an example is like truckers. We're not there yet so far. It's only been enhanced to enhance security, but there are several companies, there's no question about it, they're working very hard. They're investing a lot of money to try and automate the trucking industry. We'll probably see that in long haul trucking on interstate highways, certain types of interstate highways. There's been a lot of tests now in Europe and the United States. And then we'll also see it, for example, from, we're already seeing tests of it where they're taking certain types of trucks and they're taking it from the highway to, say, port facilities. So when you have a defined route that is very well known and it can be learned by the technology like that, that's probably the early areas that are going to be displaced, which of course requires training and retraining those individuals for other parts of the economy. Before the pandemic, of course, we had such low unemployment that there was a tremendous amount of jobs available. Now unemployment is back up again, but hopefully within a year or two, unemployment will be back down and there'll be a lot of job opportunities. Overall, we're still creating far more and better jobs than the technology is displacing. And I expect that to continue. That's been the general trend since the early days of the Industrial Revolution. But it is true that, for example, farmers were displaced when the tractor and other automation was adopted in farms. But at the same time, there were tens of millions of jobs in the United States that were created that paid better and provided a higher quality of life that no one could envision until they were created. And that's a situation we're in now. It's just that people have a lot of fear and they don't see what's coming. I'm much more concerned at this point about the slow adoption of AI systems, which, by the way, as you know, KYield, we don't focus on displacing workers like some companies do. We focus on enhancing the workflow and making workers more valuable and more content in their work and enjoy it more. Because really, if you get down to it, when you do audits and interviews in organizations, you'll find most people want to do a better job. They're just lacking the tools. A lot of times there's many obstacles in the way of being able to do it. They need training, they need the right tools. So that's what we're trying to provide here with the KYield OS. But I'm far more concerned that we won't adopt specifically our type of system, so prevention of catastrophe. So for example, those who are concerned about jobs need to remember that over the past 20 years, we've had 3 major catastrophes that were preventable. Starting with 9/11 and the Phoenix memo with the FBI. Again, experts warned about it. It sat on the servers. It didn't get acted on in time. Had specific names of the people on those airlines that hijacked the airlines. If that had been acted on in time, 9/11 wouldn't have happened. 2 wars, trillions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of people killed and on all sides of the conflicts, and huge numbers of Americans that were disabled and had lifelong complications. So we'll be dealing with that for generations. A classic example of prevention. Then we had the financial crisis, a different type of crisis. It's systemic. It requires a different type of installation across organizations to catch it. However, that costs tens of millions of jobs. And it took a decade for New Mexico to catch up in the state that I live in to get back to where they were in jobs just from the financial crisis. And it was just in time for the pandemic. So, and now we have a pandemic, which is yet another different type of crisis. Pandemics we've been worrying about for decades. That requires international efforts. You can do national work. You should do national work. However, it obviously needs to happen at a global scale, and you need the right type of preventative systems installed. We still don't have them, even after trillions of dollars spent on this pandemic. So when you're concerned about job loss, remember that these major catastrophes that are preventable cost more jobs than all of the automation in history. And so that should be our focus, is preventing these things. But the same is true at the organizational level in corporations. Several, as you know, Rob, several of the companies that we've dealt with in the midst of crises, at first they typically respond where, oh no, it's not going to be that bad. There's a lot of denial. And then as you see their stock value plummet, and then the layoffs hit, they often replace the entire management team. In several of the companies that we've dealt with in the past few years where they've lost thousands and thousands of employees just because they didn't have the right system installed. And so prevention is where I would focus on. We can't risk being so fearful of specific job loss that we risk the whole country at the national level or the whole organization. And I'm afraid that's what many cultures are doing.
Thank you, Mark. In summary, what would you recommend as the three major takeaways from today's episode?
Well, let's see here. It's hard to think about only three sometimes, so I'm thinking here. One would be the need for enterprise-wide AI systems, because that enables the other important issues. So first would be a system like the KYield OS. Again, ours is patented, and this is why it's much easier to work with us. We're pretty flexible on how we work. I guess we're going to get into that a little bit later. But by far the best way is to work with us rather than attempt to reverse engineer. But we're happy to provide consulting and help others do it if they want to build their own. But it's really important to get the enterprise-wide system installed correctly and have the right function. And that is a huge job, almost 25 years of R&D into this. But that, and number two, that enables functions like prevention and productivity. And so that would be the second sort of issue, is that first you have the enterprise-wide system installed, right type of system install it correctly, monitor it correctly, and then that enables these other functions that you need in the system, like the enhanced productivity to overcome the huge amount of public debt that we have, many of the other problems in the economy, and the prevention capabilities. And also, we talked earlier in the first episode about security, not so much in this episode, but security is also systemic. So that enables those three functions by having that enterprise-wide system. And third, I guess it would be on the fear of jobs. In fear, we don't want to allow our fear of specific job replacement let us fall behind, especially at sort of the national security level, national economic level, but also at the state level and individual organizations. And so you really, and that goes to one of our other principles about maintaining a competitive advantage. So I would tie in that we don't want to allow fear to cause much more fear of job loss, to create massive job loss and cost us a competitive advantage and fall behind. So those are the three that come to mind.
Mark, thank you for your insight today, and we will be putting out our final episode next week. So please stay tuned, and We will also share with you a scenario, if you so desire, where all 15 principles are in an operation, and the scenario is in a story-like fashion, so it's quite easy to understand. Thanks again. Thanks for watching.
Thanks, Rob, and appreciate you hosting these. And also, I should say that Rob helped us on that scenario. He's done those professionally over a long period of time. And it highlights, actually, the principles are highlighted in the scenario very nicely. So you can see how it's being, how each of these principles are important in an actual scenario. So I encourage you to do that. We're going to follow up. Anybody that's interested in receiving that scenario can just email us, or for example, you can email contact@KYield.com. Be happy to send you a copy. So thanks, Rob. Have a great day.
Do the same.